One message, one unknown number, three photographs, three images of my wife kissing someone.
But shocking part was, my wife wasn't caught cheating. She was presenting evidence. I didn't throw the phone, didn't shout, didn't feel my heart break. I let her think she was winning, and then I crushed her.
The night I discovered my wife was preparing to dismantle my life, I was alone in my corner office on the 42nd floor, a glass and steel box suspended above Lowe's Angels. The city lights below shimmered like distant, dying stars, beautiful, indifferent, temporary. I'd been reviewing quarterly performance metrics when my phone vibrated against the polished walnut desk. One message, one unknown number. Three photographs, three images that rewrote everything. Alina, my wife, the woman who glided through charity galas with effortless elegance, the woman who never glanced at a wine list longer than 2 seconds before ordering something flawless, the woman whose smile had been calibrated to perfection, equal parts warmth, mystery, and social dominance. She was kissing another man. In the first photograph, her hand rested on his jaw in a dimly lit restaurant, fingers positioned delicately enough to be intentional. In the second, they stood close in the mirrored expanse of a luxury hotel lobby, her reflection angled just enough to make sure her face was unmistakable. In the third, they leaned against a concrete pillar in a parking garage, bodies aligned, intimacy undeniable. But what chilled me wasn't the infidelity. It was the composition. Alina hadn't been caught, she'd been framed. Every photo was staged as if she wanted to be seen, wanted me to see. The angles were deliberate, the lighting too clean, the timing too precise. This wasn't carelessness. This was choreography. I didn't throw the phone, I didn't shout. I didn't feel my heart fracture in some cinematic explosion of pain. You don't get to manage billions in assets for 2 decades without learning that emotion is simply another variable, dangerous when ignored, lethal when indulged. Instead, I enlarged each photograph and studied them the way I'd analyze a hostile acquisition. Backgrounds, angles, shadows. The restaurant in the first image was a low in Beverly Hills, exclusive, expensive, not the kind of place a struggling artist could afford without assistance, which meant Alina had paid. The second photo was taken inside the Chateau Marmont. Iconic, discreet, a place chosen by people who want their secrets to feel glamorous, a hotel that whispered affair without ever saying the word. The third image was more interesting. A parking structure in the Arts District. Industrial, anonymous. The timestamp read 3:02 p.m. on a Tuesday. Tuesday afternoons were when Alina volunteered at the Children's Hospital. That detail disturbed me more than the kiss. Not the betrayal, but the ease with which she lied about helping sick children while spending afternoons with her lover. That level of compartmentalization wasn't accidental. It was practiced, strategic, almost admirable if it hadn't been aimed directly at me. The photograph still contained metadata, location stamps, timestamps. No attempt to scrub them, another choice. She wanted me to see when and where. She wanted me to build the timeline, to obsess, to spiral, to react emotionally, rage, confrontations, threats. She wanted mistakes. Mistakes she could leverage. I'd seen this playbook before. In hostile takeovers, competitors leaked information designed to provoke impulsive reactions, baiting executives into reckless decisions that could be exploited. Alina was running the same strategy at home. I poured myself 2 fingers of scotch from the crystal decanter on my shelf. A 25-year Macallan, the kind of bottle most people save for weddings or funerals. I drank slowly, letting the burn ground me while I processed what I already knew. Alina wasn't cheating. She was executing. The man in the photographs was Lucas Reed. I recognized him immediately. Years ago, when Alina and I were newly together, his name had come up once. Just once. Over dinner, too much wine. She described him as her first real love, the one who chose passion over stability, art over security. She'd said it wistfully. I should have noticed. At the time, I dismissed him as irrelevant. Lucas was nobody. A struggling painter in a decaying loft, barely paying rent, chasing inspiration, while I was closing 8-figure deals and building a reputation as one of the most ruthless fund managers in the industry. Now, staring at his face illuminated by my phone screen, I understood something crucial. This wasn't about Lucas. Lucas was a prop. This was about punishment. Alina was retaliating for a crime she couldn't articulate, being married to exactly the man she'd chosen. She wanted the penthouse in Century City, the Malibu house, the private jets to Paris and Tokyo, the designer wardrobe that cost more than most cars. She'd enjoyed every benefit. until she decided comfort felt like captivity, and I became the warden in her narrative. I called Victor Chen. It was past midnight, but when you pay people properly, they answer on the second ring. I need a full background on Lucas Reed, I said. Financials, assets, liabilities, daily routine, everything. How soon? Victor asked. Morning. No problem, no questions. That was part of the service. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I stayed in the office and pulled our financial records. Every joint account, every property, every investment vehicle. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed was airtight, drafted by the best attorneys money could buy. Infidelity voided most of Alina's claims. But trust is not a substitute for verification. By the time the sun rose over downtown Los Angeles, turning glass towers into molten gold, I knew exactly how much Alina stood to lose if I played this correctly. Victor's report arrived at 7:58 a.m. 2 minutes early. As always, Lucas Reed was drowning. His art career had peaked years ago. Galleries had moved on, younger talent, new trends. He'd tried pivoting into music with equal failure. His finances were a catastrophe, credit cards maxed out, back taxes, 3 months behind on rent for his converted warehouse studio, a personal loan from a predatory lender at 18% interest, a judgment from a former landlord, active pursuit by the California Franchise Tax Board for unpaid state taxes. Desperate people are predictable, and predictable people are exploitable. I set the phone down, finished my scotch, and smiled for the first time since receiving the photographs. Alina thought she was playing chess. What she didn't realize, I'd already seen the board. Lucas's credit score sat in the low 500s, which meant banks treated him like a liability instead of a customer. He couldn't rent a decent apartment without a cosigner, couldn't lease a car without obscene interest rates, couldn't even open a new line of credit without being flagged. His checking account history told the rest of the story: regular overdraft fees, small deposits followed by immediate withdrawals. A rhythm that suggested he was surviving on whatever freelance work or odd jobs he could scrape together that week. He wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. He was living mistake to mistake. But the detail that truly held my attention was buried near the end of Victor's report, almost like an afterthought. A single paragraph about an upcoming gallery show Lucas had been trying and failing to put together for months. A small gallery in Culver City had reluctantly agreed to give him a slot. Nothing prestigious. Nothing career-defining on its own, but to Lucas, it represented oxygen. The problem was money. He couldn't afford production costs for new pieces. He couldn't pay for proper lighting, installation, or framing. He didn't have the funds for marketing or an opening reception. No catering, no press, no buzz. The gallery owner had already warned him, without a basic investment, the show would be canceled. $15,000. That was all that stood between Lucas and the final collapse of his artistic relevance. This wasn't just another exhibition. It was his last stand, his final attempt to convince the art world and himself that he still mattered, that he hadn't been left behind by younger talent, new mediums, and shifting tastes. And now, because he couldn't scrape together $15,000, it was about to vanish. I made notes in the margins of the report: timing, pressure points, human behavior. The gallery show was scheduled for 3 months out. Plenty of time. More importantly, Lucas's financial desperation meant he would be in no position to question an opportunity that promised salvation. Desperate people don't interrogate miracles. They accept them. They don't look for traps. They grab the rope and hope it holds. I went home around 9 that morning, stepping into our penthouse as if nothing had happened. Alina was in the kitchen, sipping one of her green smoothies and scrolling through Instagram, perfectly composed, perfectly unbothered. She looked up when I entered, and I caught the briefest flicker in her eyes. Surprise, maybe confusion, maybe disappointment that I wasn't storming in with accusations and fury. I poured myself coffee, asked her about her plans for the day in the same tone I'd used for 15 years, neutral, familiar, safe. I watched her struggle to mask her uncertainty, her mind racing to recalibrate. That was the moment I knew I had her. Alina had expected drama. Rage, tears, confrontation, maybe even violence. That's what men do in the stories she liked to imagine, men driven by emotion, unraveling under betrayal. But I'd built my career by doing the opposite of what people expected, by remaining still when others flailed, by waiting while they revealed themselves. I kissed her cheek, told her I had meetings all day, and walked out, leaving her standing there with questions she didn't know how to ask. Over the next 2 weeks, I had her followed, professionally. Not out of jealousy or emotional need, but out of due diligence. I wanted the full scope of her operation. I hired a private investigator named Sarah, former FBI, meticulous, discreet. Her reports arrived daily, clean, clinical, like case files. Alina had been seeing Lucas 3 times a week, always at his studio, sometimes for hours. And the more I read, the clearer it became that this wasn't just an affair. She was positioning herself as his benefactor. She brought expensive wine, talked about funding his next exhibition, floated ideas about supporting his music experiments, promised to help him focus on his art. She wasn't just sleeping with him, she was grooming him as her safety net. Her exit strategy, the irony was exquisite. Alina believed she was clever, but she was following a script as old as marriage itself. The wealthy spouse seeks authenticity in a struggling artist, mistakes financial dependence for emotional depth, convincing herself that poverty feels romantic when it's optional. I'd watched this story play out dozens of times among my peers. Men dismantled in divorce court because they reacted emotionally, gave away leverage, made mistakes in moments of rage. I'd promised myself I'd never be one of them. 3 weeks after receiving the photographs, I made my move. I had one of my analysts set up a shell company, Delaware registration, clean paper trail, no connection to me. The firm reached out to Lucas with what looked like a legitimate investment proposal. The pitch was irresistible. A private equity group specializing in emerging artists wanted to invest $5 million into his career, funding a major gallery exhibition, producing a full-length music album, covering living expenses for 3 years while he focused on his work. Salvation. Lucas took the bait immediately. According to subsequent reports, he'd been days away from giving up entirely, considering moving back to Ohio, admitting defeat. And then this appeared. He didn't ask why a PE firm would back a 40-year-old artist whose peak had passed. Didn't question the timing, didn't interrogate the terms. Hope overrides logic. The contract was dense, 140 pages of standard investment language. But buried deep inside, on page 97, was a non-disclosure clause. Vague by design. It prohibited contact with individuals who might present competing financial interests or prior relationships that could compromise the investment. The penalty was severe, full forfeiture, plus $10 million in liquidated damages. Lucas signed it in under an hour. His lawyer, a bargain bin advisor, urged him to take the deal before it disappeared. The money landed in his account that Friday afternoon. $5 million. By Monday, Lucas had bought a new car, put a deposit on a loft in Silver Lake with actual plumbing. According to surveillance, he walked differently, carried himself like a man who believed his problems were behind him. Alina found out 3 days later. I watched her through the security system I'd installed months earlier. She checked her phone obsessively, waiting for messages that weren't coming. When she finally called Lucas, I heard the confusion in her voice. He told her everything, called it a miracle, his big break. Then he delivered the line that changed everything. He said they couldn't see each other anymore, explained apologetically that the investment came with restrictions, that he couldn't risk losing this opportunity, not for anything. Not even for her. I watched Alina freeze. Her face collapsed, then hardened all within seconds. She tried to reason with him. Her voice rose, desperation creeping in. Asked if what they'd shared meant nothing. Lucas's responses grew quieter, more apologetic. Then he hung up. Alina sat on our sofa for nearly an hour afterward. No tears, no movement, just silence. And in that stillness, I knew the game had shifted. And I knew, without any doubt, that she was trying to understand how her carefully engineered plan had unraveled so completely. I watched her through the security feed from my office downtown, the camera angles crisp, unflinching, capturing every small movement she didn't realize was being recorded. She picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again, over and over like muscle memory refusing to accept reality. I saw her pour herself a glass of wine, stare at it for nearly a minute, then walk away without taking a single sip. I noticed the way she kept touching her face, brushing her cheek, pressing her fingers to her temple, as if she needed reassurance that she still existed in a world that suddenly felt unstable. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the exact second when confidence curdles into panic, when manipulation collapses under the weight of lost control. And I felt something close to satisfaction watching it happen in real time, seeing the woman who'd believed she was 3 moves ahead suddenly realize the board had been flipped. Eventually, Alina stood and began walking through our penthouse as if she were seeing it for the first time. She ran her hands across the backs of the Italian leather chairs, paused in front of the custom art pieces we'd commissioned years earlier, stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out over the city she'd imagined herself conquering on her own terms. Her body language told me everything. She was calculating, assessing value, realizing piece by piece that without me, without the financial infrastructure I'd spent 2 decades building, she was just another middle-aged woman with a liberal arts degree, no scalable skills and expensive tastes, living in one of the most unforgiving cities in the world. I let her sit with that realization for a full week before I made my next move. During that time, I watched her cycle through a version of grief that might have been touching if it hadn't been entirely self-centered. She wasn't mourning our marriage. She was grieving the loss of her escape route. She called Lucas obsessively, left voicemails, sent messages that never received replies. She even showed up at his new loft once, only to be stopped in the lobby by security he'd hired with my money. She came home from that encounter looking like someone had been physically struck. I greeted her with the same calm politeness I'd maintained for weeks. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. The process server looked uncomfortable handing them over to a woman in a silk robe, barefoot, holding a cup of artisanal coffee she hadn't finished brewing. I'd timed it deliberately. There's something uniquely devastating about being served divorce papers while wrapped in a towel, hair still damp, stripped of all illusion of control. She read the first page. Adultery, grounds for divorce, prenuptial agreement, infidelity clause. When she looked up at me, there was something new in her eyes. Fear. I explained everything calmly, methodically, using the same tone I'd used to walk a client through a complex derivative structure. The prenup she'd signed entitled her to a modest settlement, $2 million, and the Mercedes she drove. Generous, considering she'd entered the marriage with little more than a Yale degree and social connections that hadn't delivered the value she'd promised. The photographs of her and Lucas, attached as exhibits, eliminated any possibility of emotional abuse claims or asset expansion. 15 years of consistent civility on my part sealed the rest. She hired a lawyer, of course, a high-profile divorce attorney known for tearing prenups apart. For a while, Alina actually believed she had a chance. I knew this because my legal team kept me informed of every filing, every motion, every argument. They tried the emotional abuse angle, painting me as cold, controlling, financially manipulative. It didn't hold. I had 15 years of receipts, emails thanking me for vacations, texts praising my generosity, photos from charity galas where she leaned into me, smiling, draped in jewelry I'd bought. Witnesses from our social circle who could testify that I'd never raised my voice, never embarrassed her, never behaved like anything other than a model husband. The turning point came 6 weeks into proceedings. Alina's attorney finally uncovered the connection between Lucas's investment and one of my offshore holding companies. It took time. I'd buried it under layers of structure designed to slow, but not stop, a determined investigation. When they found it, Alina thought she'd won. She believed she could prove I'd sabotaged her affair, that I'd used money to manipulate her lover, that this demonstrated controlling behavior sufficient to invalidate the prenup. I sat in a conference room at my lawyer's office as her attorney, Patricia, laid it all out. Flow charts, financial trails, shell companies, emotional appeals. What she didn't understand, what Alina didn't understand, was that I'd planned for this discovery. I needed them to think they'd uncovered something I didn't want revealed. My lawyer, Robert, dismantled their argument with surgical precision. He framed the investment as standard risk capital. Emerging artists fail all the time. Investors place bets. The personal relationship was irrelevant to the business decision. Then came the real trap. If Alina wanted to pursue this argument, she'd need to testify in detail about her affair. Every meeting, every promise, every deception. She'd have to document her own infidelity under oath, strengthening the prenup, not weakening it. She'd also have to explain why she believed her lover was entitled to my financial restraint. That's when the room went quiet. The trap was complete, and Alina finally understood. She hadn't been outplayed emotionally. She'd been outstrategized. If Alina chose to argue that I had manipulated Lucas through financial inducement, she would be forced to admit something far more damaging than anything she could ever accuse me of. She would be admitting on the record that Lucas had chosen money over her, that the grand romance she had been willing to burn her marriage down for had a precise dollar value attached to it. $5 million. That the man she'd risked everything for was no different from the husband she was so desperate to paint as cold and transactional. She could expose my strategy, yes, but only by exposing herself. only by acknowledging that both she and Lucas were exactly the kind of people who would sacrifice love, loyalty, and dignity for financial security. And that admission would obliterate any sympathy a judge or jury might have felt for her position. It would turn her from victim into willing participant, from wronged spouse into co-conspirator in her own downfall. I watched Elena come to this realization through the glass wall of the conference room. She was seated beside Patricia, hands folded tightly in her lap, posture rigid. Her face moved through emotions the way a slot machine cycles through symbols, confusion, anger, disbelief, calculation, before finally landing on something empty. Not rage, not grief, just hollow recognition. She understood then that I'd given her a choice, not between winning and losing, but between two different kinds of humiliation. Accept a modest settlement and preserve what little dignity remained. Or fight publicly and reveal to the world that she'd been outplayed by both the husband she despised and the lover she'd idealized. The settlement conference took place 2 weeks later. Elena looked like she'd aged 5 years in that short span. The woman who used to arrive in rooms dressed like she owned them now wore a simple black dress, unbranded, unremarkable. Her hair was pulled back tightly, not stylishly but defensively. She looked severe, smaller, as if the version of herself she'd carefully constructed over 15 years was quietly collapsing under its own weight. Patricia made one last attempt to extract more money. She argued that Elena had contributed significantly to my success, not through direct labor but through social capital, through hosting dinners, organizing charity events, making introductions. She painted Elena as an unpaid executive assistant whose invisible labor had helped build my career in ways that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. Robert shut it down calmly. He pointed out that Elena's social circle had produced exactly zero business for my firm, that if anything, her lifestyle had cost far more than it had ever returned. Patricia responded with detailed documentation, lists of events, guest names, photos from galas and fundraisers. She argued that 15 years of social coordination amounted to professional contribution. She even brought in a vocational expert. The expert testified that Elena's skills, event management, networking, social organization, would command a salary of at least $200,000 annually in the private sector. That 15 years of such unpaid labor entitled her to compensation well beyond the prenup's provisions. Robert countered methodically. He presented emails showing Elena had declined multiple opportunities to work, messages where she told friends she preferred being a society wife, documentation proving professional planners had handled most of the events cited, receipts showing that Elena's role was largely decorative, not operational. Our expert witness dismantled the vocational testimony completely. She explained, patiently, that social aptitude does not equal employability, that hosting parties does not translate into executive-level skills without relevant experience or credentials, that Elena had been out of the workforce for 15 years, held no advanced degrees beyond her undergraduate education, and would likely struggle to earn more than $50,000 or $60,000 annually, if that. Her comparison landed hard. Claiming Elena's experience qualified her for executive compensation, she said, was like claiming someone who enjoyed cooking could step into a Michelin-star kitchen and run it successfully. We settled at $2.3 million, slightly above the prenup, enough to appear generous, enough to close the door permanently. Elena signed without looking at me. When Patricia reached out to shake my hand, Elena pulled her away sharply, as if the contact itself might contaminate her. I didn't take it personally. I understood she needed someone to blame, and I was the most convenient target for a disaster she had engineered entirely on her own. The last time I saw Lucas was 3 months after the divorce was finalized. I hadn't planned to attend the gallery opening, but a client mentioned Lucas Reed was debuting a major show in Culver City, and curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what $5 million looked like when translated into canvas and reputation. The gallery was packed, industrial space, exposed brick, polished concrete floors, track lighting carefully angled to flatter every piece. Guests sipped expensive wine and nodded thoughtfully, pretending to understand abstraction. Lucas stood at the center of it all. He looked healthier than I'd ever seen him, confident, grounded, successful. There was a press packet at the entrance describing his work as a bold new voice exploring capitalism, authenticity, and the commodification of creative expression. The irony wasn't lost on me. His entire resurgence had been funded by the very system he was supposedly critiquing. But irony doesn't bother people when they think they're early. His paintings were good, better than I'd expected. Bold colors, aggressive brushwork, real technical skill. I stood in front of one large piece, a violent collision of red and black meant to represent urban alienation, and could see the depth, the movement, the deliberate layering. The gallery owner spoke nearby, pitching collectors with practiced confidence. She described Lucas's work as mature, focused, charged with purpose. She predicted his prices would double within a year. I recognized the language immediately. It was the same narrative construction I used with investors. The art of making people believe they were seeing value before the rest of the world caught on. Lucas stood 20 feet away, surrounded by admirers. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, a sharp haircut. He moved with ease. The desperation was gone. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just stood there facing each other across the open gallery floor, separated by polished concrete, soft lighting, and an unspoken understanding that passed between us without a single word being exchanged. And I knew, by the way his jaw tightened, by the brief hesitation in his posture, that he understood. Maybe he'd pieced it together on his own. Maybe Alina had told him during one of her increasingly frantic attempts to reinsert herself into his life. Or maybe the realization had crept up on him slowly, the way uncomfortable truths often do, until it became impossible to ignore. But standing there looking at me, he knew exactly where his sudden reversal of fortune had come from. And he knew the price he'd paid to secure it. There was something in his eyes that suggested he wanted to speak, to say something, anything, gratitude, anger, confusion, a demand for clarity. But the non-disclosure agreement he'd signed was explicit, airtight, and very specific where I was concerned. It prohibited direct or indirect contact with me in any form. And Lucas, whatever else he might have been, was not stupid enough to violate a contract like that in a room full of witnesses. So we did nothing. We held each other's gaze for a brief electric moment, and then we both looked away. Before leaving the gallery, I purchased one of his paintings. A smaller piece, priced at $60,000, according to the neatly printed sheet by the wall. I arranged to have it delivered to my new apartment in downtown Los Angeles and hung it in my bedroom, directly across from the bed. I wanted to see it every morning when I woke up. Not because I admired the art, though it was technically impressive, but because it served as a reminder. A reminder that everything and everyone has a price, and that the real skill in life isn't avoiding payment. It's knowing precisely what you're buying. Alina moved to Santa Barbara shortly after the divorce was finalized. She bought a small bungalow near the beach using her settlement money, and according to mutual acquaintances, reinvented herself completely. She branded herself as a life coach, a guide for wealthy women seeking authenticity, a mentor helping others escape toxic relationships. The irony was impressive. If I'd been the kind of man who laughed, I might have laughed at that. She never mentioned Lucas in this new version of her story, erased him entirely, as if he'd never existed. As if the affair, the plotting, the destruction had all been figments of a former life she'd shed like an inconvenient skin. And oddly enough, I respected that. It meant she'd learned something. I saw her once more about a year later at a charity gala in Beverly Hills, an event I couldn't avoid without offending clients who mattered. She was there with a new boyfriend, a yoga instructor, or a meditation teacher, something vaguely spiritual, something that suggested emotional depth without financial stability. She looked happy, not performatively happy, not strategically happy, but genuinely at ease in a way she'd never been with me. When our eyes met across the ballroom, she didn't flinch, didn't turn away. She gave me a small nod, an acknowledgement of shared history, of mutual damage, of everything we'd taken from each other. I returned the nod and went back to discussing investment projections with someone who controlled a mid-size pension fund. I didn't think about Alina again that night. I'd learned that the past is only useful as data, something to analyze, to extract lessons from, to apply toward predicting future behavior. It's not something to linger in or regret. She'd tried to hurt me. I'd hurt her more. Not because I was cruel, but because I was better at the game she'd chosen to play. And in a strange way, I think we both got what we needed from the wreckage. Lucas's career continued to rise, at least for a while. He landed a second gallery show that outperformed the first. Started dating a young actress from a streaming series I'd never heard of. He appeared to be living the life Alina had promised him, the one she'd used as bait before I'd made it real. But Victor kept tabs on people I invested in long after my direct involvement ended. And according to Victor, Lucas had started drinking heavily. The inspiration that once came naturally now required chemical assistance. He'd told someone at a party that he felt like he'd sold his soul for success and didn't know how to buy it back. I didn't feel guilty. Guilt requires the belief that you've done something wrong, and all I'd done was respond to an attack with efficiency. Elena had tried to weaponize emotion to strike where she believed I was vulnerable, and I'd shown her very clearly that I didn't have the vulnerabilities she assumed. I had resources, patience, and a complete lack of sentimentality when it came to relationships that existed primarily on paper. That had been more than enough. What surprised me, looking back, was how little the experience had changed me. I'd expected to feel something: triumph, vindication, satisfaction. Instead, I felt the same controlled detachment I'd always lived with. My life continued uninterrupted. I still managed billions in assets, still attended the same events, still woke up alone in apartments that were beautifully designed and fundamentally empty. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep refused to come and the city lights cast long shadows across my bedroom, I'd stare at Lucas's painting on the wall and wonder what it might feel like to care deeply enough about someone to be destroyed by their betrayal. I tried to imagine what Elena must have felt when she realized Lucas had chosen money over her. What Lucas must have felt when he understood the cost of his success. But I couldn't quite reach those emotions. I'd spent so many years suppressing them that they'd withered into something I could observe, but not experience. My therapist, a woman I'd started seeing after the divorce because it seemed like something successful people were supposed to do, suggested that my inability to feel deeply was itself a kind of prison, that I'd traded authenticity for control, and ended up just as trapped as Elena had been in our marriage. I told her that sounded like exactly the kind of thing a therapist would say, that I was paying her to help me sleep, not to re-engineer my personality. But her words stayed with me, because they contained an uncomfortable truth I didn't want to examine too closely. The prenup had protected my assets. The NDA had neutralized Lucas. The divorce had freed me from a marriage that had become more burden than benefit. But none of those victories had made me happy. I'd won every battle and somehow lost something I couldn't quite name. Something that had nothing to do with money, or power, or measurable success. I'd proven I could outmaneuver Elena, but I'd also proven she'd been right about me. Cold, calculating, and fundamentally alone. The real genius of Elena's revenge, I eventually realized, wasn't that she tried to hurt me. It was that she forced me to reveal myself, to show everyone, including myself, exactly how far I'd go to win. She wanted pain. I responded with strategy. And that response told us both everything we needed to know about why our marriage had been doomed from the beginning. I ran into Lucas one last time, about 18 months after his first gallery show. It was at a coffee shop in Venice Beach, where I'd stopped to meet a client. He was sitting alone at a corner table, staring at his phone with the kind of intensity that suggested he was using it as a shield against the world. As I walked past, he looked up, our eyes met again, and this time, despite the NDA, he spoke. And by speaking, he was risking everything. He said my name, just Adrian, quietly, without emphasis, without hostility. I stopped mid-step and turned back toward him, studying his face, waiting to see what could possibly be worth $10 million to say out loud. The NDA was still active. He knew that. I knew that. Which meant whatever came next had been weighed carefully. He asked me if it had been worth it. Not just the money. Not just the outcome. But the entire construction, the layers of shell companies, the manipulation, the collateral damage. The lives bent around my decisions. He didn't ask with anger or accusation. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just a genuine, almost academic, curiosity about what kind of person would go to such extraordinary lengths to win. I told him the truth, or at least the version of the truth I'd learned to live with. I said I hadn't done it for revenge. Revenge implies emotion, and emotion implies attachment. What I'd done, I explained, was risk management. Asset protection, a controlled response to a hostile action. Elena had initiated a threat to my financial and reputational stability, and I'd responded using the tools I understood best. No different than countering a competitor attempting to sabotage a fund or destabilize a market position. I said it wasn't personal. We both knew that wasn't entirely true. Everything about it had been personal, so deeply personal that I'd had to frame it as strategy just to survive my own reflection. But I wasn't ready to admit that. Maybe I never would be. Lucas listened carefully, nodding, as if the answer aligned with something he'd already expected. Then he asked a question that landed harder than the first. He asked whether I had ever actually loved Alina, or whether our marriage had always been a transaction. I considered lying, considered offering something softer, something that would make me seem more human, less like the villain in the story both of them probably told themselves. But I was tired of pretending, and the coffee shop was loud, crowded, indifferent. No one was listening, so I told him the truth. I said I didn't know how to love in the way he meant, that I'd been raised by parents who treated affection like theater and emotion like liability. That vulnerability was something to be managed, not expressed. By the time I'd met Alina, those lessons were so deeply embedded I couldn't tell the difference between genuine feeling and strategic behavior. I said I'd provided for her, protected her, given her every material comfort she'd ever claimed to want. If that wasn't love, I didn't know what else to call it. But I also admitted that it probably wasn't what she needed, or what anyone with a normal emotional framework would recognize as love. When I finished, Lucas looked sad. Not sad for me, sad for all three of us. Three people locked inside different versions of the same prison, built from choices we'd made long before we understood the cost of making them. He said Alina had loved me once, before indifference and absence ground that love down into something hollow. That she turned to him not to punish me, but because she was desperate to be seen as something other than an acquisition or status symbol. He said I'd won the war, but I'd lost something more valuable in the process. And that one day I'd understand exactly what that was, but by then it would be too late to recover it. I told him he was probably right. People like therapists, yoga instructors, and struggling artists usually are when it comes to emotional truths. But I'd made my choices, and I'd learned to live with the consequences. I said I didn't regret what I'd done. Regret assumes the capacity to choose differently, and I wasn't wired that way. I couldn't imagine responding to Alina's betrayal with anything other than the cold calculation I'd applied. I said we were all exactly who we were meant to be, products of upbringing, circumstance, and accumulated decisions, and that trying to become something else was just another form of self-deception. Lucas laughed then, not mocking, not cruel, a bitter laugh that carried more understanding than judgment. He said that at least I was honest about it, which was more than most people ever managed. Then he told me he'd tried to contact Alina after the NDA expired. Wanted to explain, or apologize, or maybe just hear her voice again. She'd blocked his number, never responded, erased him completely. He said he respected her for that, even though it meant he'd never get the closure he probably didn't deserve anyway. We shook hands before I left. A strange gesture between two men who'd been locked in a shadow war orchestrated by a woman neither of us had ever truly understood. And in that moment, I felt something close to connection, a recognition of shared damage, as close to intimacy as I was probably capable of experiencing. I told him his art was genuinely good, that the painting I'd bought was one of the better investments I'd made in years. He laughed again and said that at least something positive had come out of the entire mess. I thought about that conversation for weeks afterward, turning his words over during sleepless nights, staring out at the city as it sprawled beneath my windows like a circuit board of unrealized possibilities. He'd been right, I had lost something, even if I couldn't yet name it, even if I wasn't sure whether it had been worth the price of winning. The money was still there, the success was still there, the respect and fear of my peers was still there. But alongside it grew an awareness I couldn't dismiss. I started noticing things I'd previously ignored. The way couples looked at each other at dinner parties, an ease, a warmth that had never existed between Alina and me. The way younger colleagues talked about their families with enthusiasm, as if home was somewhere they wanted to be, rather than another obligation on a calendar. The way people formed bonds without calculating return on investment, and how those bonds sustained them through adversity in ways my carefully optimized life never could. I dated occasionally, women from my social circle who understood the rules, who didn't expect depth or permanence. But I found myself measuring every interaction against the idea of what Alina and Lucas might have shared. Not the reality, which had been doomed by fantasy and imbalance, but the possibility that two people could choose each other for reasons unrelated to leverage, security, or status. I'd spent my life optimizing, and the painting Lucas had created, the one hanging in my bedroom, began to change meaning over time. What I'd once seen as a trophy, proof of control, started to feel like an accusation. A mirror reflecting the cost of victory. The red and black chaos that critics described as urban alienation looked more like emotional devastation the longer I lived with it. And sometimes, late at night, I wondered whether Lucas had known, while painting it, that it would eventually belong to me. Whether he'd embedded something into those violent strokes that would only reveal itself slowly. A message about what winning really costs. A reminder that control and connection are rarely compatible, and that some victories, once claimed, can never be returned. I saw Alina one final time, nearly 3 years after our divorce had been finalized, at a meditation retreat in Big Sur that a client had recommended as a way to manage stress. I arrived expecting a collection of overworked executives cosplaying spirituality for a weekend. What I didn't expect was to find myself seated in a group session with her, both of us cross-legged on thin yoga mats, while an instructor spoke calmly about releasing attachments and finding peace in the present moment. The retreat center sat perched on cliffs above the Pacific, one of those carefully curated sanctuaries where wealthy people temporarily pretended money didn't matter while paying obscene sums for the illusion of detachment. The main meditation hall featured floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean, and even through thick glass, you could hear the waves breaking against rock, steady, indifferent. The instructor was a woman in her 50s who'd reportedly studied for years in India and Tibet. She spoke in that deliberate, softened cadence people use when they want every word to sound meaningful, as if silence itself were sacred. There were about 20 of us in the session. Most looked exactly as expected: tech founders in expensive athleisure, entertainment executives practicing stillness between deals, trust fund children searching for meaning in experiences money could still purchase. And then there was Alina, seated near the front, posture flawless, eyes closed, breath moving in perfect rhythm with the instructor's voice. She looked more at peace than I had ever seen her during our marriage. She was different, softer, as if she'd finally released the performance she'd maintained for so long. Her hair was longer, less precise. Her clothing favored comfort over design, and when she smiled in response to something another participant shared, it reached her eyes in a way it never had when she smiled beside me at galas or dinners. There was no calculation in it, no audience. She noticed me watching her. Our eyes met across the hall, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something in her expression that unsettled me. Pity. The instructor happened to be speaking about compassion at that exact moment, describing it as the ability to understand suffering without being consumed by it. And I wondered if Alina was applying that concept to me. She held my gaze for maybe 3 seconds, then looked away. Not with resentment, not with discomfort, just a brief, neutral acknowledgement, like passing a stranger on a trail and recognizing shared humanity before continuing on separate paths. When the session ended and people began drifting out toward the afternoon break, I found myself following the same path toward the ocean cliffs that Alina had taken. I told myself it was coincidence, that I wanted fresh air. The view, but we both knew I was choosing, deliberately, to engage one last time. Even though nothing we said could change the past or meaningfully affect the present. We walked together along a narrow path overlooking the ocean, not because we planned to, but because avoiding each other would have felt more artificial than acknowledging what we were. She asked how I was doing. I gave the expected answer: work was good, life was stable, and she nodded in a way that suggested she heard everything beneath the surface of those words. She told me she didn't hate me anymore, that she'd spent years angry, bitter, replaying our marriage in her mind, but eventually realized I'd given her exactly what I'd always offered, that I'd never promised to be anything other than what I was. She said she'd been young and naive when we married, convinced she could change me, or that wealth would somehow compensate for emotional absence. And she admitted she'd been just as wrong as I was, to believe someone who needed what she needed could ever be fulfilled by what I was capable of providing. I asked her if she was happy now. She said yes, and the way she said it left no room for doubt. She'd found a community that measured success differently. People who valued connection, growth, presence. A life that probably looked absurd to someone like me, she admitted, but one that felt authentic for the first time since before we'd met. She said she was grateful for everything that had happened, even the humiliation, even the pain, because it had forced her to confront who she actually was instead of who she'd been trying to become. I told her I was glad she'd found what she was looking for, and I meant it. Her happiness no longer intersected with my life in any meaningful way. She'd become a stranger with shared history, something I could observe with detached curiosity, the way I might analyze the outcome of an investment I'd exited years earlier. She'd moved on, I hadn't changed at all, and we both understood this was likely the last conversation we'd ever have. Before we parted, she told me something I've thought about every day since. She said Lucas had contacted her the previous year, after the NDA expired. That he'd finally worked up the courage to reach out, and they'd spoken for hours about everything that had happened. He'd told her about running into me at the coffee shop, about our conversation, about what I'd said regarding my inability to love. Lucas had suggested that perhaps the real tragedy wasn't that I'd destroyed their relationship, but that I'd done so without ever truly understanding what I was destroying. She said Lucas eventually realized I'd done him a favor in a perverse way, that the success I'd engineered for him had taught him truths he needed to face, that he could be bought, that his principles had a price, that the romantic image he held of himself as an artist above material concerns was just another comforting illusion. She told me he'd stopped painting after his second gallery show, that he couldn't create anything authentic anymore once he understood where the money came from, that he'd moved to Portland, taken a job teaching art to high school students, and chosen a quieter life. I asked her what she'd learned from everything. She said she'd learned you can't punish someone for being exactly who they've always been, that my response to her affair was perfectly consistent with everything I'd shown her throughout our marriage. She'd wanted me to feel pain the way she did, to be devastated, abandoned, emotionally shattered. But I wasn't capable of those emotions in any functional way. Trying to force them, she said, was like expecting a calculator to cry. The only real surprise, she admitted, was how completely I'd outplayed her, how I'd turned her attempted revenge into a demonstration of dominance. But even that, she said, made sense given my nature, my competitiveness, my inability to accept loss in any context. We stopped at a bend in the path where the ocean stretched endlessly below us. She wished me well. I wished her peace. And then we walked away from each other without ceremony, without regret. Two people who had finally understood exactly who the other was, far too late to matter. And for the first time, I wondered, not what it had cost me to win, but what it might have been like to lose. She told me she didn't blame me for what I'd done to Lucas. She said she thought it was cruel, unnecessary, even, but cruelty implies intent, and intent implies emotion. And what I'd done, in her view, wasn't emotional at all. It was procedural. A sequence of decisions executed with the tools available to me. The way I'd been trained to operate. Strategy, not spite. Optimization, not rage. That distinction mattered to her, she said, because it allowed her to let go of the idea that I'd acted out of hatred. And in doing so, it allowed her to finally stop carrying the weight of what I'd done as something personal. She understood now that I hadn't been trying to punish Lucas or destroy him. I'd simply neutralized a variable that threatened my stability. We hugged before she left. It was awkward, in the way only intimacy without emotional access can be. Two people who had shared a bed for 15 years, who knew the rhythms of each other's bodies, but never learned the language of each other's inner lives. The embrace lasted a second too long, then ended too quickly, like we were both afraid of pretending it meant something more than closure. I watched her walk back toward the retreat center, her movements unhurried, unguarded. There was an ease to her posture that hadn't existed when we were married, as if she'd finally learned how to stand in the world without bracing herself for disappointment. She didn't look back. I stayed on that cliff overlooking the Pacific long after she was gone. The ocean stretched endlessly below me, indifferent, vast, waves rising and collapsing with no awareness of witnesses. I thought about everything she'd said, and everything I'd never be able to say, not because I didn't want to, but because I lacked the internal framework to form the words. There were no reference points in my emotional architecture for vulnerability or remorse or longing. Those concepts existed for me only as abstractions, not experiences. The sun was setting by the time I finally turned back toward my car, painting the sky in deep purples and violent oranges. It would have been beautiful, I assumed. I recognized that intellectually. But beauty to me had always been another data point, something to be cataloged, assessed, and moved past. Not absorbed, not felt. I drove back to Lowe's Angels in silence. I thought about Lucas teaching art to teenagers in Portland. About Alina building a quieter, more intentional life near the coast. About the pattern that connected them and me. The invisible wake of damage that seemed to follow wherever I'd been too close for too long. I wondered, not for the first time, whether there was any function to my existence beyond accumulation and dominance, beyond winning. My therapist would later tell me these questions represented a breakthrough. That self-awareness was the first step toward transformation, but it didn't feel like progress. It felt like confinement. I could see the limitations of my emotional design with perfect clarity. I could understand, in theory, what I was missing from the human experience. But understanding didn't grant access. It only sharpened the awareness of absence. I was locked inside myself more completely than Alina had ever been locked inside our marriage. And unlike her, I couldn't leave. Because the prison and the prisoner were the same thing. Life continued. I managed funds. I attended events. I maintained the outward appearance of success with the same precision I'd always applied. But something had shifted in the way I experienced it all. Every transaction became a reminder of my inability to connect. Every negotiation reinforced my isolation. Every victory confirmed that I'd optimized for the wrong variables and had no idea how to recalibrate. I'd secured my assets, protected my reputation, outmaneuvered every threat. But in doing so, I'd stripped away the last illusions about who I was. I could no longer pretend to be misunderstood or misjudged. Alina and Lucas had seen me clearly by the end, and now, so had I. The painting still hangs in my bedroom. Lucas's chaotic explosion of red and black. I've never stopped looking at it, and I've never fully understood it. Some nights I imagine it screaming, rage and frustration trapped in pigment and motion. Other nights I imagine it laughing, amused by my futile attempts to extract meaning from what may have been nothing more than technical exploration. Either way, it's the closest thing I have to a memorial, a $5 million reminder that victory doesn't always feel like winning. I'm 50 now, 5 years removed from the moment Alina first tried to destroy me. The life I've built looks even more impressive from the outside. My net worth has doubled. My reputation has become almost mythic. Younger analysts study my trades the way music students study classical compositions, searching for patterns they can imitate without fully understanding. But none of it touches the core truth of my existence. I wake up alone. I work alone, even when surrounded by people. I sleep alone in rooms filled with expensive objects that mean nothing beyond their resale value. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd responded differently to Alina's affair. If I'd allowed myself to feel hurt, betrayed, broken in the way normal people do when trust is violated. Maybe we would have divorced anyway. Probably, but maybe it wouldn't have turned into this elaborate game of manipulation and counterattack. Maybe I wouldn't have destroyed Lucas's creative spirit. Maybe I wouldn't have validated Alina's worst assumptions about my emotional emptiness. Maybe I would have learned something about myself beyond the fact that I'm exceptionally good at winning conflicts that don't matter. But that line of thinking leads nowhere. It's the emotional equivalent of day trading based on yesterday's charts instead of tomorrow's probabilities. Speculation without utility. I am who I am, shaped by choices I can analyze endlessly but cannot undo. The best I can manage is this cold self-awareness that acknowledges damage without claiming the right to regret it. Alina found peace, Lucas found humility, and I found confirmation. Confirmation of everything I'd always suspected about myself. And those outcomes were likely inevitable, given who we were beneath the performances we maintained. The roles we played were written long before we ever met. We simply acted them out with expensive consequences. The city spreads below my windows tonight like it has for thousands of nights before. Millions of lights. Millions of lives I'll never know, never understand. I'm writing this not because anyone will read it or care, but because sometimes the only way I know how to process experience is to convert it into data, to structure it, to record it, to account for it. This is my story, the chronicle of a marriage that was never truly a marriage, of a victory that never felt like one. The only thing I've learned from all of it is this: being right doesn't make you happy. Being successful doesn't make you less alone. I won. Alina lost. Lucas learned an expensive lesson, and all three of us ended up exactly where we were always headed, shaped by who we already were, not by what happened to us. This is the truth of it, stripped of sentiment. Stripped of illusion. It's not absolution, it's not redemption, it's an accounting, because even cold calculation eventually demands one.